I'm Professor Wallace. I'm chairman of the ILI, and welcome to you all. Yona has described the program as disaster relief and diplomacy, mutually supportive. And he notes that this tragedy requires us to react and cope, but suggests there may be some diplomatic advantages in how we do that. Let me turn this over now to Jennifer and family. Brief remarks, and then on to Yona. Jennifer?
Hi, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon and bearing with me with the sick child home today. I'm pleased to be part of the group this afternoon talking through the following on the trend that Yona has had looking into the wake of a pandemic and how our government and our military can support other countries and other societies through tragedy and loss. So we're here to support the panelists. I'm certainly not the expert here, but I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yona?
Thank you very much, Professor Don Wallace and Dr. Jennifer Buss for your short welcoming remarks. And we're very pleased to see even a representative of the next generation that would have to follow in the future. At any rate, for both Professor Don Wallace and Dr. Jennifer Buss, as always, our deep appreciation for decades-long support of our academic work. Let me first welcome and introduce our very distinguished panel. I think that technically, from what I understand, we will have a short bio listed on the screen when we represent them. So first would be Ambassador retired Charles Ray. We do have on the screen, I think, the slides, so I won't go into details except to mention, obviously, that he participated for a number of years with us on the role of diplomacy, and his very distinguished contribution as ambassador, and also in the military service and so on, as you can see, particularly the Vietnam role, and also his academic work in recent years. And the next speaker is Ambassador retired Stephen McKinney. Not yet. At any rate, so we will introduce him when he comes as a distinguished former ambassador and also contributor to our academic work and to the public. Ambassador retired Peter Romero. You there?
Sure.
Right, a former U.S. ambassador to Ecuador, chief of mission to the embassy in San Salvador, as well as a former assistant secretary of state for the Western Hemisphere of Europe. And then the next one on the program, we will have first Mr. Doug Strope. As you can see, is the very distinguished bio division chief of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and so on. It will be followed by Mr. Franklin Moore. I see you there. So, as you can see from his very distinguished background, that he also former Deputy Assistant Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development Bureau, and now affiliated with the Center of U.S. Senior Executive Service. And then finally, our colleague and commentator, very distinguished Dr. Daniel Gerstein. You have is a short bio there, particularly his work in the U.S. government as a former Department of Homeland Security Undersecretary, acting Deputy Undersecretary for Science Technology, and adjunct professor now at American University, as well as national security author, and diplomatically also the member of the Oldbrook delegation to negotiate the peace settlements in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, this is the program, and so I really hope that the first hour, the invited speakers will make an initial presentation after 10 minutes. So we are going to cover the first hour. We're going to follow up the second hour with Q&A discussion, and then concluding remarks. At this point, I would like also to mention that we invited to our Zoom event, in addition to the speakers that we listed now, also a selected number of distinguished colleagues, attendees, as well as students and interns and friends will participate at the event, and some of them will join us during the discussion segment of the program with brief questions and comments. Now, what I would like to do at this particular time is to move with very brief remarks as moderator, just to make sure that it's clear how we approach this kind of challenge from both Mother Nature and man-made. The methodology basically is interdisciplinary, international, and open, unclassified information. And obviously, as academics, we cooperate for many decades with the U.S. government and Congress, the judiciary. And I may mention at this time briefly that during the past 3 years, the COVID, very sadly, tragically, we look at the statistics as of even today, that in the United States, we had over 100 million of cases at over 1 million of deaths, and internationally, probably 676 million, and probably closer to 7 million dead. So again, academically, we try to deal specifically during the pandemic with many Zoom events, as well as publications, reports, and studies over the years. Now, just one word about the earthquake. Obviously, as Don mentioned, we're going to focus now on Turkey, Syria, and so on. But obviously, we have to look at some other earthquakes around the world, as well as the role of diplomacy, cooperation in terms of mitigation responses internationally of dozens of countries. And finally, I think we can obviously focus on the role of diplomacy to deal with both domestic and international terrorism and violence. So with that, I would like to invite our first speaker according to our program. Will make the first, I think, introduction, and then we'll follow up with the other colleagues. So we would like to invite again our colleague, Ambassador Retired Charles Ray.
Thanks a lot, Yona, and I'm really honored to be here with such a distinguished group of experts. I'm hardly an expert, but I would like to sort of address the issue from the standpoint of someone who has been impacted by this. You know, according to data from the Institute for Economics and Peace, between 1960 and 2019, there was a 10-fold increase in the number of reported natural disasters, something like from 39 in 1960 to 396 in 2019. In 2005 alone, there were 402 incidents with a death toll of about 90,000. These incidents or these natural disasters can be either be low intensity events that happen frequently, like flooding and droughts, or they can be one-off catastrophes like the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia that claimed over 200,000 lives, or the recent earthquakes in Syria and Turkey, which claimed over 30,000. The most common of the natural disasters, though, I mean, the earthquake, the tsunami, these draw a lot of attention. But 42% of the disasters that claim lives and displace people each year are actually flooding, and many of them are related to climate change, and this will only increase as time goes by. Flooding followed by storms, earthquakes, extreme temperatures, droughts, wildfires, and volcanoes. And added to all this, added to what nature throws at us each year, you have from 30 to 40 armed conflicts each year that cause humanitarian emergencies, displacement, and deaths. Now, many people would probably not think of natural disasters as a subject that would lead to a discussion of diplomacy, but that's clearly not the case. To start with, in order to have effective international response to natural disasters, you have to have a robust diplomatic effort to bring countries together and to organize to get relief to the needed areas as quickly as possible to try and save as many lives as possible. In addition, history has shown that given us examples where disasters and the disaster relief efforts have opened brief windows of opportunity to deal with other crises. And it's interesting. We just had, the earthquake in Turkey in 1999. Earthquakes that hit Turkey and Greece hit at a time when these two countries had a very tense relationship. But in the response to the earthquakes in 1999, Turkey and Greece put aside their differences to assist each other in dealing with the aftermath of this disaster. We saw, for example, in the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia, the international response from the U.S. and other countries was quick and was fulsome. The thing to keep in mind, though, when we talk about diplomacy and natural disasters is that the window of opportunity opened by a disaster for diplomacy is only effective when there has been prior diplomatic activity and when the parties involved are predisposed to put aside their differences. I think, as an example, currently, Assad in Syria has been using this earthquake as a means to further punish his opposition in certain parts of the country, and there's been a counter diplomatic effort on the part of the U.S. and the Western world to try and mitigate this. We saw during Katrina, for example, this was before our rapprochement with Cuba. We rejected offers of assistance from Cuba for Hurricane Katrina, and the reason given was that the Cubans' condition for their assistance to us was that sanctions against the country be lifted, and so that didn't work. I think, though, that if we look at the role of diplomacy in natural disasters and the benefits that can come out of it, if we are willing to look at this as a phase. I mean, diplomacy is a process, and in effect, actually, so are natural disasters. You have the pre-disaster preparation, immediate responses to a disaster, and then the post-disaster recovery phase. And if we look at it in terms of areas that we need to have good relations with that also might be prone to disasters, and I predict that the situation we're seeing in Turkey is not the last. An interesting side note: one of the reasons that earthquakes are so predominant or so common there is that the continent of Africa is moving northward toward Europe at the rate of a few centimeters per year. This is I think the term uses the ring of fire, and as the plates slide under each other, I think you're going to see more disasters like this in that stretch along the Mediterranean into Turkey and Syria. We need to invigorate our diplomacy before disasters, to have procedures and policies in place to deal with them when they arise. We need to be involving not just the governments, but also the possessors of knowledge, the scientists, the relief experts, transportation experts, and equally important, the affected communities, either potential or actually affected communities, so that assistance can be applied quickly and in proper places, and so that we can take advantage of the temporary opening of a window of opportunity when these situations arise. So as we've said in previous seminars of this type about the role of diplomacy, like defense, like development, is one leg of our international relations tool that we can ill afford to ignore. it needs to be active, it needs to be vigorous, and it needs to be well supported. And this is nowhere more apparent than in dealing with natural disasters, and the world has more than enough. You have 10 million children in the Sahel who are in jeopardy because of conflict and natural disasters. You have the Cyclone Freddy in Mozambique and Malawi, which has killed over 300 people. Climate change and the conflict in Ethiopia has resulted in over 500,000 deaths and hundreds of thousands of displaced people. And I could go on and on. But I think the point is clear, is that diplomacy is something that needs to be vigorous and needs to be on the spot in terms of dealing with natural disasters before, during, and after. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray, for your initial presentation. Obviously, we are not going to ask, questions for your very important insight about the Mother Nature and man-made and the role of diplomacy and the lessons learned, and to be prepared, but we'll have an opportunity later on during the discussion. With that, I would like to move on to our next speaker, according to the program, Ambassador retired Stephen McCain. I think you're here.
Yeah, yes, I am here.
Okay, wonderful. And on the bar on the screen, can we have the short bio? Right. So I think both the speakers and the audience can look at that very distinguished background as a former U.S. ambassador, and his work also at the National Defense University and dealing with the refugee issues and so on. And also very distinguished academic work and so forth. So we would invite you to share with us your experience and views on this topic, and then we can move on to the discussion during the Q&A session. Mr.
Okay.
Ambassador.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And also thank you for Ambassador Ray for setting the stage for today's overall conversation. One of the things that you noticed in my bio was there's a combination, yes, of diplomacy, military education, as well as my current role as co-chairperson of the board of the Women's Refugee Commission. And I like to point out that my interests in gender issues and humanitarian assistance aren't new, but actually a result of a long career dealing with these subjects, starting from my work on refugee affairs in the Department of State. I also, while at our mission to the United Nations in the late 80s, worked on the Commission of the Status of Women, and back to National Defense University. I also helped to introduce Women, Peace, and Security into the overall curriculum of NDU and other senior service schools. And I think it's really important for us to focus on what are we talking about when we are talking about humanitarian assistance and disaster response? Because what we're really focusing on is that these are stability operations that require the full gamut of diplomacy, defense, and development in successful outcomes. And so that if we understand that HADR is really a stability operation, that is really important for us to know that the role of the military, supported by diplomacy, is to provide for the safety and support to friendly non-combatants while suppressing threatening forces. And that also has to be expanded to include protecting civilian responses from U.S. civilian agencies, United Nations components, and non-governmental organizations. And as Ambassador Ray pointed out, these operations encompass everything from natural disasters such as earthquakes, storms, and flooding to insurgencies and upheavals. It's further complicated when, in the case of situations such as the recent humanitarian response to the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, that all of these issues were combined in one setting. And then, as Ambassador Ray pointed out, that we still have to look at further down the track as how these issues are exacerbated by the impacts of climate change and related circumstances that could result from drought, cross-border incidents, and migration. So I think to better understand the complexity of these operations, we should understand clearly the respective elements that ensure appropriate outcomes. And I think the Women, Peace, and Security Index very clearly shows the link between the security of women and stability operations. Nevertheless, women and girls are still differentially impacted by conflict. Also, women remain underrepresented in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and post-conflict building efforts. So that when we talk about these operations, we need to focus on that in order for them to be successful, there are three components that always have to be taken into account. That's one, mitigating gender-based violence. Two, promoting increased healthcare infrastructure, particularly for women's sexual health and reproduction. And three, identifying additional safeguards for protecting vulnerable populations, including people with special needs and disabilities. So in order to include all of these elements in these stability operations in our overall response to humanitarian assistance and disasters, that we have to overcome what I call the key barriers to the inclusion of WPS and HADR processes. First is the lack of political will. Women's participation in peace processes requires commitment by decision makers to proactively include them. But this is not a consistent priority for those in charge, including members of the UN Security Council who do not implement their own resolutions on WPS and gender. And these issues tend to drop to the bottom of the list whenever we talk about response. We also don't have enabling environments for women human rights defenders and women peace builders to speak out. In particular, poor understanding by decision makers that women's participation requires proactive measures, including transparency on how to participate and dedicated resources to enable their conclusion. And then there's also insecurity and reprisals against women rights defenders and peace builders. So what we also often find in these situations that women leaders regularly face hostility, violence, and other attacks for their activism, elevating their risk of possible reprisals for engaging in peace-building processes or other public affairs. So therefore, in order to have successful outcomes for humanitarian assistance and disaster response operations, we really have to have full, equal, and meaningful inclusion of all parties, including women in these stability operations. We have to take proactive measures to engage women's human rights activists and peace builders. We have to create an enabling environment for their participation. We have to ensure the direct, substantive, and formal inclusion of diverse women in positions of power, in the military, positions of power in diplomacy, positions of power in non-governmental organizations, so they can influence the outcome and other processes as well in the implementation of humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And so therefore, across the board, we have to have full, equal, and meaningful participation that should be systemic, timely, and transparent. And I think then we can address what we really want to do when addressing these situations, and that is we can have the ongoing monitoring of agreements, political processes, when necessary, constitution building, economic development, transitional justice and reconstruction, and in some cases, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, as well as security sector reform. We also have to set up mechanisms for informal, advisory, or ad hoc, or other means of inclusion to match whatever formal structures that we use to address these issues. So therefore, we really have to focus, I think, going forward in the discussion, understanding how greater integration, inclusiveness, and integrity of gender issues, and women in particular in international security, can be achieved to ensure that these principles that we're talking about today, fully live and not just exist in theory. So in conclusion, I just want to come back to some 4 major points. That one, integrating these elements requires ensuring a gender perspective in all areas, not just on women, peace and security, or women's rights, but also in economic recovery and governance. Siloing gender issues to spaces that aren't equal and full and meaningful in their participation in public discourse not only undermines gender equality and equity in international security, but serves to defeat the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. We also need to recognize that women are not a homogenous group, that they come with diverse opinions, diverse representational views, diverse ethnicities, and all this has to be incorporated so that any conflict analysis should include age, gender, and disability analysis to better understand the different needs and capacities of the affected vulnerable populations and the barriers that they face to participation in these recovery efforts, as well as their full participation. So therefore, what we really need are, to underline the key priorities for stronger integration, inclusiveness, and integrity of women in international security, that this must mean prioritizing the issues that pose barriers to them before we begin to address how we're going to achieve equity and humanitarian assistance in disaster response. So essentially, inclusiveness also means going beyond just our normal way of approaching these things, but approach them in a way that understands the full ramifications and implications of not having a comprehensive understanding of the role of gender and women, rather than relying tried and true formulas that don't necessarily bring us to the successful outcomes that we want in these situations. So I think I'll stop here, and so we can begin to have a much more fruitful discussion. But I just wanted to underline that if we're going to address these issues in a way that are going to lead to successful outcomes, we're going to have a much more holistic approach and a comprehensive understanding of what are the ingredients necessary for the successful outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, again for sharing your lessons learned and the list of very critical, I think, steps for what works all the way from this stability operation to the role of government diplomacy, civilians, gender issues, and basically to address the needs for inclusion of different segments of the society, particularly the gender issues and so on. So we'll come back to you, obviously, during the discussion. It gives me, again, great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Retired Peter Romero, Do we have the bio on the screen? Thank you again. Again, in the interest of time, we will have the full bios in the report, but this time all the way from Ambassador to Ecuador. Incidentally, we had also earthquake in Ecuador recently, and also his work as former Assistant Secretary of State for the Western, as we mentioned before, and so forth. So I think to get his perspective, both in government and academically in the private sector, Mr. Ambassador, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Yona. I appreciate it. I have to admit, though, when your invitation came across my email inbox, I read it very quickly and thought that it was perhaps a commentary on my years at the State Department, disaster diplomacy. Luckily, with closer look, I was able to determine what the subject matter was. Indeed, my mother has always kind of told me, why do you always, why do the countries that you're always assigned to seem to have disasters associated with them? And I said, Mom, I go to those countries. Okay, they don't fall into the disaster category after I've been there, because I've been there. Over a 25-year career in the State Department, and then several years heading up NGOs in the United States, I've dealt with hurricanes, floods, cholera, epidemics, civil war, gang violence, earthquakes, et cetera, but as a practitioner, and I want to stress that. So there's a lot of literature on this subject, but I can only tell you what my experience over probably close to about a 35, 40-year period has been. I started with the question of, does disaster diplomacy open up channels of communication and new diplomatic possibilities? And from my own experience, what I was able to come up with was communication, yes. Host country immediate needs generate intense dialogue between host country nationals, affected country nationals, governments, et cetera, in the United States. And particularly between potential donor countries and the United States. So communication rapidly opens up. Does it involve new diplomatic possibilities? I think that there has been a notion that perhaps because this happens, that somehow the past is wiped away and that there's new possibilities. I think the track record shows that disasters and the assistance that flows from them does not mitigate or even reduce grievance, resentment, or violence over the medium or long term in a lot of these countries that are suffering from it. In fact, some people could even make a case that there's a nexus between disasters and prolonging the conflict. And I guess the key to all of this is what kind of quality of governments existed before the disaster. And if there's marginalized groups in that country, if governance is not good, there is a greater chance of longer term suffering and deprivation. I'm not so sure disaster tends to lead to new diplomatic openings nor greater possibilities. I think Ambassador Ray suggested that Cuba, for example, reached out during Katrina with conditionality to help the survivors in New Orleans and the surrounding area. China did the same thing. I don't think anybody remembers any of that to this day. So I'm not sure that the offers or the actual assistance that flows really has a long-term effect on the diplomatic possibilities. I think the quality of good governance is key. And I think the best examples of how it works has been more or less a man-made, although punctuated by earthquakes and other things in the case of Colombia. I think that you've got relatively good governance in Colombia. We've had a long-term, the United States commitment to plan Colombia. certainly man-made disaster, most of it, a 65-year persistent violence and human rights abuses in a civil war. But at the same time, they've had substantial economic growth with our assistance and that of others, and their own focus. Health indices are up, homicides are down, investment is up, etc. And I think that is a success story that I'd be willing to talk more about if there's any interest in that. I think the poster child for what can go wrong in the Western Hemisphere is Haiti. After $2.6 billion in the last 12 years, and literally billions of dollars before that, the country is plagued by, and some would even say run by gangs. The government has begged for international force to deal with the violence. They cannot do it. There was a recent GAO report that was highly critical of our assistance and that assistance of NGOs and others. There are some bright spots, and there is a December 21st accord, which I think holds some real promise. But what I tried to do, and let me finish up with this, is to try to kind of amalgamate the 40 years or so that I spent, in this area, to try to come up with a pattern, okay, that happens after natural and man-made disasters. And I don't want to be cynical here, but I want to be practical, okay? So the first thing that happens is there's predictions of disaster, okay? They're all over the press or all over the media, okay? Then comes early reports start to dribble in, cell phones, social media is awash with people on the ground reporting to their loved ones in the States, etc. Then comes a massive deluge of localized information, media sources. I think governments, particularly ours and our own national media, try to piece all of this together to try to find out what it means. There's further international media that arrives. They chronicle the suffering, etc. You see that displayed on all of our news organs. The U.S. government comes forward. Diaspora groups in the United States start to get animated and active. There's a clamor for action. NGOs get involved. The National Guard is oftentimes deployed by state governors, particularly if there's a large diaspora community from that country in the state. And I cite probably more often than not New York State as an example of this, okay? I worked with a lot of governors as assistant secretary. Hospital ships are deployed. Federal government our federal government becomes involved. Then the United States government announces a response. Most people just look at the numbers. They don't know the details behind it, but they look at the numbers. Other governments start to respond based on our numbers. National leaders of the affected countries come forward and make their appeals, and they expect a dividend out of all of this. And then comes this universal inertia. And I use the word inertia because there are so many actors and so many resources directed at so many different things that it's really, if not impossible, very difficult to try to harness all of that. Okay, the U.S. after a time, particularly after the first. I think the first stage of crisis management starts to happen. There is, kind of an inertia that can't be stopped, so to speak, in terms of aid flowing and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's announced. Sometimes there's long lag times in between what's announced and what time the aid gets there. But to try to harness it or to control it in any way becomes very, very difficult. The governments, particularly in the case of Haiti, see this, as I said before, as a dividend more than an opportunity. The media moves on, international media moves on to the next crisis. And the U.S. government, as well as the other donor governments, increasingly get frustrated by the government's inability to reform itself, which was key to all of this to begin with, okay? And as a consequence, starts to channel more of that assistance towards the private sector, okay? The government, after a time, feels like it's weathered the storm. It moves on. Very little enduring reforms to show for itself. Oftentimes, corruption, waste, marginalization of populations, grievance, resentment continue. And then the next episode, the next disaster comes, and it's rinse and repeat. I think probably the lesson that I get from all of this is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to change the cycle. But it's also, I think, that an opportunity, particularly after the immediate crisis has ended. That being that as soon as crisis management starts to wind down, there is an opportunity to condition the assistance, to reach out to the other donor nations, to reach out to NGOs, to reach out to all of the major players involved, to condition the assistance in such a way as to put pressure on governments to change, to do the right thing, so that we have a different set of circumstances the next time that there is a natural or man-made disaster. And with that, I'll turn this back over to you, Yona.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, again, for sharing your own lessons in addition to our other colleagues. And I think this process that you discussed, the pattern, and particularly the emphasis on good government, which is the key, as you mentioned, that sadly there are some countries that present not exactly the democratic process that we're looking for. But at any rate, we'll come back to you a little bit later on. It gives me again a great pleasure and honor to introduce Mr. Doug Strope. As you can see from his bio on the screen, Dilling is the current USAID response manager for Turkey and Syria earthquake response, division chief of the Office of Africa, West Africa Division of the USAID, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and the government lead for international disaster response. And again, his background with the experience working on many other challenges dealing with the disaster, as you can see, over the years, and is very distinguished, I think, academic experience and his military service. And with that, please, Mr. Strope, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. I have to admit I'm honored and very humbled to be asked to be speaking to this group, and very excited to be following the three ambassadors who have already spoken. And as you heard, I'm from the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and I represent one of the tools the ambassadors have at their disposal following a disaster or some sort of crisis within their country. Specifically, I'm from the new Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, or BHA we call it. For those that aren't familiar with that term, in 2020, USAID went through a bit of a reorganization, and we merged the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, or OFDA, and the Office of Food for Peace, or FFP, together into one giant bureau known as the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And this allows us to have more efficiency, effectiveness, a larger budget, a larger voice at the table, and to make sure that we're speaking with one U.S. government coherent voice with regard to our foreign disaster assistance there. In my current role with BHA, I'm serving as the response manager for the Turkey and Syria earthquakes response. So this is where I was activated on February 5th, immediately after the earthquake, and stood up a team here in Washington, D.C. And we support our field team, our disaster assistance response team that's operating in the field as well to lead the U.S. government efforts for the disaster response there. Within BHA, our mandate is to save lives, alleviate human suffering, and reduce the impact on physical, social, and economic areas with regard to a humanitarian response there. We've got a global mission, as you've already heard. In 2022, we responded to 74 different disasters around the world, and this was in 64 different countries. And during 2022, we had a budget of $11.8 billion of which to accomplish this humanitarian assistance. Most of our funding comes during the steady state period, where we're trying to build up the resiliency of countries so they're able to absorb the shock, able to recover, able to respond to their neighbors' needs there. And we spend a lot of time doing resilience and disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness training. A lot of our assistance also comes in the form of food assistance, which we provide. However, most of the crises and emergencies we respond to are what we call complex emergencies. Some sort of man-made disaster, often civil war, strife, or conflict there that is causing the humanitarian assistance that exists there. And within my office, we certainly don't look at humanitarian assistance as a tool for diplomacy, but I'm also not naive enough to recognize that it isn't. We respond as USAID with our mandate because it's the right thing to do. It's what we've been asked to do by the legislators, appropriators, the administration, because at the end of the day, the government is we're a benevolent, philanthropic country, and we want to do the right thing in this space. And so we look out to find ways to do this, and we have a very politically neutral mandate to be able to do so, and are greatly supported by both sides of the aisle. However, like I said, I fully acknowledge our ability to execute our mandate is a tool for diplomacy, and it is something that we are able to get out there and share American values and represent the U.S. government in the space. When we do decide to respond on behalf of the government, there's usually 4 criteria or 4 questions we'll ask before we send in some form of a response. The first is we try to identify that there is some sort of evidence or knowledge or information that demonstrates that there are unmet humanitarian needs in the area of which we're considering responding. We then look and see if that our assistance would be able to save lives or alleviate suffering should we decide to respond. Then we ask, has the government requested assistance, or do we know that they'd be willing to accept foreign assistance, and specifically assistance from the U.S. government? And then the fourth question we ask is, does responding align with U.S. government policy priorities and interests from a humanitarian response aspect there? Like I said, we do respond all around the world. We have staff located in multiple countries, strategically positioned along with warehouses around the world, so that we have staff and resources as close to those disasters and we can get them in as soon as possible after that disaster happens. We have them embedded at various diplomatic missions, military combatant commands, and other areas that are prone to have disaster strike in that area. And we also work closely with UN agencies and non-governmental organizations to be those implementing partners. You often don't see the US government on the ground being that last point in the assistance line, but we'll try to work with those local or international NGOs, those local communities, or the UN agencies there to try to respond there with that local culture and demeanor on the response there. And again, we have the ability to deploy a disaster assistance response team, or a DART, on a moment's notice anywhere around the world. And the DART will get on the ground and immediately start doing assessments. They'll try to figure out what the response priorities are, and they'll coordinate that US government response from their position as close to the disaster as we're able to get. Specifically looking at the current disaster I'm managing, the earthquakes that took place in Turkey and impacted Turkey and Syria. I think many are aware that this happened on February 6th, start of the 7.8 magnitude earthquake, followed hours later by a 7.8 aftershock, and there's been over 16,000 aftershocks and tremors since. This area struck in Turkey and northwest Syria, and it had the destructive force of 132 atomic bombs. Our disaster experts that are on the ground now have said it's uncomparable to anywhere that they've been, and these are seasoned disaster responders that have been all around the world following earthquakes and volcano eruptions and civil wars and strife. And they said the disaster they've come across is unlike anything they've ever seen. More than 52,000 people have died in the two countries thus far. At least 3 million people have lost their home, and hundreds of thousands of buildings were damaged or destroyed. After the ground stopped shaking in consultation with the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and the deputy assistant of state who oversees Syria, the decision was made to deploy a disaster assistance response team and stand up the response management team here in Washington, D.C. We immediately dispatched 2 USAID urban search and rescue teams. These were the teams from Fairfax County here in Virginia, and also from Los Angeles County in California. The teams were 160 people. They flew out on 2 military aircraft with their 12 canines as well, and were on the ground within a day and a half after the earthquake there to immediately start performing rescues, building assessments, and augmenting the disaster response capabilities of the Turkish government. With that 160 urban search and rescue personnel and their 12 dogs, we also had 40 disaster assistance experts hit the ground there and start looking to see what those needs are and how the U.S. government response could take place there. And our personnel that were on the ground, including the canines, they go out branded. They have, I don't mean to be flipping this, but they almost look like NASCAR drivers, the way we brand them up, with the USAID logos on the back of their jackets from the American people. It's clearly that they are representing the U.S. government there, and clearly are a tool of diplomacy in that regard there. So we make sure that our assistance, when it does go out the door, is noticed and identified there. In addition to sending the urban search and rescue teams immediately, we then got on and started sending supplies, blankets, tents, cooking sets, hygiene kits. We pulled these out of our warehouses, and within the first 2 weeks delivered 10 747s worth of equipment, over 8 million pounds of supplies that were delivered from the American people to the folks of Turkey and Syria there. And those commodities also go out branded, so that there is an acknowledgement that these commodities came from the US government. But there is an exception. Again, we do this with the vision of trying to figure out how we can provide the most philanthropic and humanitarian need where it is needed. And if there are situations where having something go out with the American logo on it would prevent it from getting into the hands of those in need, or possibly cause harm by the association with the US government, then we have commodities that are non-branded, we call them, that we'll send out. And this is what most of the stuff that went into Syria, it went out non-branded because there was fear that beneficiaries would deny it because it could get them in trouble with the Assad regime there. And so we sent our stuff out there in a non-branded mode, and our partners that operate in that, we allow to do so a bit more discreetly and don't publicly acknowledge their association with the government. So the response looks a little bit different on the Turkey and the Syria side there. In addition to the commodities and the urban search and rescue that we had got the door, I already shared that DoD flew our urban search and rescue teams out to the region on their large cargo C-17 aircraft. We also used DoD to provide local airlift. They sent 13 helicopters to the region, which we used to move over 600,000 pounds of assistance from the ports and from the airports to the actual communities and remote areas where they were needed. DoD also donated and assembled a 125-bed field hospital that has ICU and surgical capabilities. and they deployed 75 people there to run those operations and assemble that hospital. Additionally, they sent a ship that was loaded with humanitarian commodities to Turkey, and through a military to military engagement, they were able to transfer those commodities as well. So using the diplomacy in the form of the defense there also was appropriate on this response. And all told, DoD spent about $25 million of their commodities and donated supplies, such as the hospital, for the response. So in addition to the money that DoD's brought to the table, USAID's brought $160 million worth of funding that we've used to purchase commodities and fund nonprofits and NGOs, local NGOs, international NGOs, and UN agencies that are on the ground in both Turkey and Syria, performing the assistance there. And our colleagues at State Department's Office of Populations, Refugee and Migrations, or PRM, they've also contributed $75 million to the response that's gone to organizations that focus on refugee needs in the region. And just a little side note there, when our urban search and rescue teams left, they left behind several $100,000 worth of supplies that they donated to local responders in both Turkey and Syria. These responders were able to come up, they got some real-time training, if you will, on the equipment, and then that equipment was turned over to them to help augment their supplies and be able to use them also following a disaster. Of note, the supplies we donated to the Turkish organization known as the White Helmets, they're already using the donated supplies not only for the earthquakes, but sadly for the bombing campaigns that are still going on there. And the team that turned the supplies over to them said it was quite emotional because the supplies that they had with them were some of the supplies that were previously donated to them in 1999 following an earthquake that they had maintained and sustained and continued to use. And now we were able to refresh that a little bit by leaving some of these supplies and some training behind with the responders on both sides of the border there. And the final point I'll touch on here, given the topic was diplomacy, we have exercised our colleagues at the United Nations quite a bit on this. We have the United States mission to the United Nations there in New York, and they helped us secure additional border crossings from Turkey into Syria. Previously, there was only one UN Security Council approved crossing into Syria for humanitarian assistance. For the disaster, they were able to negotiate now to have 3 border crossings. They were also able to negotiate with the Assad regime, I don't want to call it visa waivers, but some visa flexibilities for responders responding into Syria, and allowed the United Nations to have a little greater roam in the area that they traditionally don't have in Syria there. So there was quite a bit of negotiations going on there, a lot more that can be done, especially when dealing with the Assad regime. But we did have a lot of Security Council work going on there and some high-level diplomacy taking place there in New York on our behalf. And then finally, we work with the private sector. We have the Center for International Disaster Information, or CIDI.org, that shares best practices on how the private sector can respond to the disaster, but also how the diaspora communities and American public writ large can support ongoing relief efforts there. And we use this as a tool for our embassies that are often overwhelmed from people expressing how can they help. This tool is able to redirect them and saying, these are the best practices and these are the organizations you may want to consider working with. So, well, diplomacy often comes from our office in the form of where we are, where we're working, our ability to represent the US government. And certainly when we are in the field, we're out there not only as humanitarians, but we're out there as Americans, and that presence there that comes with hopefully and usually a good association there. And it's great working with all the different ambassadors I've had the honor to work with. And I'm sure we could sit around and tell stories about disasters for hours on end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strauss, for your insights and status actually of the humanitarian aid and the practical assistance of U.S. Tool, the current mission, and also the role of diplomacy. We appreciate very much, obviously, that kind of report, and also to look at some of the delicate issues related to the situation in Syria, opposed to what's happening in Turkey. So thank you very much. We'll come back to you. We're going to ask also Mr. Franklin Moore to join us and to make his presentation as former Deputy Assistant Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Bureau, and his work at this time. Mr. Moore?
Thank you, sir. And also thank you very much for the invitation to participate. I think I'll be a little shorter than your first presenters, and I'm going to try to tie together some things that they have said thus far. So we start with the concept of humanitarian aid. And humanitarian aid we see as a response to disasters and emergencies. Ambassador Ray laid out a series of emergencies and disasters that take place. In all of them but one, you have a very direct effect on food and the availability of food for a population. So I'm going to look at this from the perspective of food, also because that's where I spent most of my sector time when I was at USAID. Humanitarian assistance is one bucket. The other bucket that USAID deals with is development assistance. Development assistance is intended to deal with structural problems and issues. They could be physical. You have a health system that doesn't have clinics, so they physically need clinics. Or it could be human. And many of the things that Ambassador McGann talked about in relationship to women fit into this area. And I'll come back to why that's important. From the disaster assistance and what we do in disaster assistance, we are governed by three principles. Those principles, the first one is humanity. As Doug said, the first question they ask is, does whatever has taken place have an effect on human suffering? And are what we are about to do going to help to relieve human suffering? The other two principles for humanitarian assistance, which are kind of different than development assistance, is the idea of neutrality, i.e. humanitarian assistance will go anywhere that people need it, and impartiality, humanitarian assistance will not decide that one person gets a response and their neighbor does not get a response for some reason. Now, Doug mentioned the word resilience. At USAID, a lot of work was done to put together how do we link humanitarian assistance more directly with development assistance. And resilience was seen as a way to do that, which allows one to do some things with humanitarian assistance, some things with development assistance. So Ambassador McGann's pieces, because there are development assistance involved, one can begin to move them in. But that movement between the two requires a fair amount of diplomacy quite often, because one is often dealing with some aspects within a country that do not adhere to the principles of neutrality and impartiality. And therefore, as you come in with that second wave, as you're moving out of the humanitarian assistance, you have to deal with that. So there's one set of diplomacy, I think, that relates to how do we take these three principles that we use for humanitarian assistance and make use of them as we make that shift to development assistance. The other area where I think there is a fair amount of diplomacy, and I can speak to this directly. You know, I spent 3 years in Rome. I was in a special job as the advisor to the ambassador to the Rome-based organizations, one of which is the World Food Program. So one of the other aspects of diplomacy is between what the US government is doing directly and what is taking place by international organizations, primarily the UN. In the case of food, it is the World Food Program. Now, why does this sometimes get complicated? The United States independently is the largest provider of humanitarian assistance. But we are also the largest funder of the World Food Program. We fund about 40% of the World Food Program. So in fact, the United States is involved in giving money bilaterally and giving money multilaterally, being involved in solutions that are bilateral and being involved in solutions that are multilateral. And there are many cases where it is diplomacy that helps to link these together and helps us to be able to learn something in one of those spheres and move it over to other spheres. So the World Food Program, for example, was able to experiment and look at what happens when local purchase takes place and how should local purchase be carried out. And that has influenced the whole concept of local purchase in the beginning of a movement from providing goods to providing cash and vouchers. The third area where there's a little diplomacy that takes place is inside the US government. Because as you look at who it is and where do we get the resources for the humanitarian assistance, it is not just the budget of AID and State Department. Some of that also comes from the Department of Agriculture. If you recall, back in 1961, when the World Food Program was established as something to deal with humanitarian assistance, we, the United States, provided primarily excess food that we had at that time. And that excess food was provided through the Department of Agriculture. And the Department of Agriculture still has a role because we still provide some provisions and we provide some cash. So as I look at diplomacy, there's diplomacy both inside the US government that gets carried out. There's diplomacy between the US and other donors. There's diplomacy between the US and recipients. And there's some diplomacy that is necessary between the US bilaterally and the US multilaterally. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore, for your sharing with us again the humanitarian aid assistance for emergencies and disasters, and focusing on the topic of food and the role of Department of Agriculture and so on, and the role of diplomacy. We appreciate very much your comments, and obviously we'll come back to you during the Q&A discussion. So now it gives me great pleasure again to introduce Dr. Daniel Gerstein, who is going to share with us his experience as a former government official at the Department of Homeland Security, and also working the U.S. Military, and again during the past several months or so, he participated in our academic program. So then, please.
Well, thank you very much, Yona. And this is a tough group to follow. I was just kind of ticking off some of the things. And, just very quickly, let me say, as I go through, Ambassador Ray talked a lot about preparedness, response, and recovery and the role of diplomacy. And then Ambassador McCann talked very eloquently about this relationship between women and peace and security outcomes. Ambassador Romero reminds us of both good governance, but also the dreaded patterns of disasters that we should really probably seek to avoid. Mr. Stoops talks from a very operational perspective and reminds us of the mandate for how do we as a government get involved in these disasters, but then also, what guides those decisions. And then finally, Mr. Moore reminds us of this relationship between disasters and development and the relationship between diplomacy. What I'd like to do is remind the group that what we have been talking about so far is really thinking very much about the effect on the host nation. But I'd kind of like to take that and flip that around just a little bit. Because in my roles in government as a senior official in both the Department of Defense and in the Department of Homeland Security, I find that disaster relief, the diplomacy aspects actually have mutual benefits that we often don't talk about and that we often need to remind our government, more broadly, our citizens, our general society, how important these relationships can actually be. So I'm going to talk about my time in the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate, where we had bilateral relationships with 13 different countries in the European Union, and then some of the less formal R&D relationships that we developed and why they were so important. And then I also just want to remind the group, and I don't know that you need that much reminding, but about the unique perspectives and capacities that the Department of Defense brings. So in going about this, I thought I would just tick off a couple thoughts about what are some of these mutual benefits. So first, of course, are the trusted relationships and the access that we get and generating goodwill. But we also get some very important insights into how these countries function. And, that helps us long term. And I think what we're talking about extends not only to natural disasters, but also human-induced events. So as many of you have talked about, the planning, preparing, mitigation, response, and recovery are essential in what we're talking about. And I also think there are great opportunities for sharing of science and technical data. And let me just give you some examples, again, from both DoD and DHS. So my first one is Japan, and it was in the aftermath of the Fukushima tsunami and nuclear disaster. And I had the opportunity to be a political appointee in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy. And, it was being able to bridge that gap between the science and the diplomacy of being able to work with the government of Japan to understand what they were sensing, connect that to what we were taking in from our readings from Department of Energy and from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency in terms of the technical data that was being generated and making decisions based on this technical data. And it came down to not only the relationships with the Japanese government, but it also came down to the relationships of the US government in these very, very technical areas. And so big benefits there. In our bilateral relationships, it's fascinating how much we got from the other countries. The Netherlands, they are experts in water management. What they face is what is faced in Louisiana, in New Orleans, when the levees are topped. And there is so much to be learned. And much of what we gained from that bilateral relationship, we were able to bring back for flood mitigations, here in the United States. And we learned so much, we incorporated so much. We also thought it gave us a leg to think about areas like climate change, which is going to exacerbate what we're seeing in some of these very troubling areas. The next one I'll take you to is New Zealand. And I went there immediately after the earthquake in Christchurch. And their plan for building back was extraordinary. They had already come to the conclusion that you just can't replace Christchurch in the same way that that city was laid out. So in places where the fault line was particularly severe, they put in parks. And in places where the ground was more solid, more static, and less prone to geological events, they put in their housing. And in places in between that, they could put in low-rise buildings and have shopping centers and things like that. They thought about those areas. And it just gives you sort of an approach, the same type of approach that we had to think about with regard to the Puerto Rico hurricane that occurred almost a decade later, in which we have to think about how do we actually build back. Another opportunity we had a number of countries that we did biodefense work in. And by biodefense, we considered, extremely dangerous pathogens like tularemia or anthrax. And we worked, for example, with Sweden on understanding their work in tularemia, because they actually have endemic tularemia and understand these kinds of things and how to work and talk to populations about it. We also worked very closely in Australia with them on two very important viruses that could emerge as potential pandemics, Nipah and Hendra virus. And so very, very important in terms of this collaboration. And oftentimes I feel like we lose focus and people don't understand that it is really a two-way street of what we get by providing this assistance and getting this access. So with that commentary, I will stop and I'll turn it back over to Yona for the conclusion of the program.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gersten, for sharing with us your experience, particularly looking at some of the cases of the different countries and the benefits, the question of trust and goodwill and so on. And also as commentator, I appreciate dealing with some of the insights of our former speakers. And with that, what I would like to do is to move on to the discussion segment, the Q&A, first of all, by our speakers. Anyone who would like to make a comment at this time, and then we're going to turn to those that we invited attendees, and we have already a number of people all the way from the Gulf to the US who would like to ask a question or make a comment. So please feel free, whether it is Charlie in the beginning, according to our list, or anyone else who would like to make a quick comment at this time.
Well, I just sort of like to say, I think listening to the other speakers, it strikes me that my thought as I was preparing for this is that this is a very complex issue, and listening to the speakers, I see that I was thinking, right, it is very complex, but each person I think made some very good points, and I especially like the point about domestic diplomacy, that is the requirement that we coordinate and share information learned within the U.S. With the various agencies and with the public. But just a point that to underscore, I mentioned that, the diplomatic windows that open during these crises are transitory. They're temporary. They're not permanent. But I don't know that I would would necessarily agree that they can't be taken advantage of. It's a matter of what we've done before. And of course, during an emergency, during a crisis, the key is how many lives we save and how much aid we get to where it needs to be. But I think the follow-on, that taking advantage of these open doors and trying to build better governance, better relationships, and just my own experience, I was at the University of Houston right after Katrina and during Hurricane Rita. And I can tell you, and I still have contacts there, people in the government might not remember the foreign assistance that came to New Orleans and other places, but I can tell you the people down there remember the Dutch, the teams that Professor Gerstein mentioned, these flood disaster guys. People in certain parts of the bayou remember them, and they remember them clearly. And this is something that we as a government need to be able to take advantage of, is this impact made on the ground by our disaster relief people. What do we do as a government to go in and build on that? And with that, I will pass it on to someone else.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. Ambassador McGann, any comments at this point?
One thing I think I would like to start off by saying that one of the most important things about this discussion, or any discussion on humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and I'm adding stability operations, is the importance of talking about gender, women, peace, and security, even when women aren't visibly in the room. Because it won't work unless we as men start talking about these issues. That's the first thing. But I also like to point out that when we look about all these various operations, we have to have a understanding of the importance of gender equity at the beginning of the process, right? Because often the principles that we may have concerning gender equity and inclusion and outcomes may not exist in the conditions in which we're going into. So in very many ways, the United States and its partners may have to, in effect, impose these values as we're helping. It's not just the linkages begin later in the response to the crisis, but they actually begin at the beginning. Secondly, I do want to emphasize the fact that we have to fully comprehend the role of the U.S. military in these operations and why we think of them as stability operations. The reality is that our military is likely to engage in HADR in the coming years, as opposed to expeditionary deployments that we saw in previous years. And the fact that DOD understands this is seeing that all of the combatant commands now have gender advisors, right? To the point that there may be more gender advisors in DOD than at state, to be quite honest. So I think that we have to really focus on the totality of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in our responses to these situations. And that totality is ever evolving in terms of the mechanisms we bring to bear to achieve it, but we still have to have an overarching framework that starts from the moment of deployment to through that phase in which we move from humanitarian assistance, immediate assistance, to a much more development assistance and sustainable process, because you can't build resilience unless you also have sustainability. All right. So we have to understand that the role that we play in humanitarian assistance and disaster response is not a tertiary role, but in fact, it has to be central to overall thinking of how we engage diplomatically in this humanitarian and development space.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're going to ask Ambassador Peter Romero for a comment at this point.
Just to say that I continue to be impressed by people who are engaged in humanitarian assistance, and this panel is no exception to that. I think that all of you have direct experience rolling up your sleeves and getting this done. I think that what we need to do, though, is what I talked about in my brief remarks, and that is to look at things in the long term, or else we're going to continue. A lot of these countries that are in difficulty with continued natural disasters and human-made disasters are part of a continuous cycle, whether it be Syria, whether it be Turkey, whether it be Haiti. And I guess my thoughts more than anything else is to not take your eye off the ball in terms of what's been spoken of here, in terms of mitigating the suffering, but also to look at this as an opportunity and one that needs to be worked on in a very intense way, so that these conditions, particularly the conditions of poor governance and violence, are not mitigating factors or particularly critical factors in the years ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for this comment. Doug Swope, any comment at this point?
No, I'll just build off what Ambassador Romero said. There is, my office has a very keen focus on trying to work ourselves out of a job. When we're not on a disaster response, we're there building the capacity, the capabilities, the resources of those countries, so that hopefully the next time they don't need to call for assistance, or the assistance that they call in is less than it was before. And we do have success stories in Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, where they've not only not needed as much assistance as in the past, but they've become responding governments as well to regional disasters there. So that's a model we look at, but it certainly doesn't cover the harder ones, the ones that are bad governance, the ones that are civil strife and conflict, your Sudans, your Syrias, your Central African Republic. I mean, to say that you're on emergency response for 12 plus years starts to question, is this an endemic situation, or is this still under the auspices of humanitarian assistance, which is a whole other conversation there. But completely agreed that humanitarian assistance is not meant to be that long-term solution, but how do I work with my colleagues in the rest of USAID and at State Department to try to address those other issues as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much again for your comment, Mr. Franklin Moore.
Well, I would just support what Doug just said. I was there 10 years ago when the conversations were hot and heavy over how do we look at humanitarian assistance and how do we look at development assistance and how do we marry them in a way that there is some sort of continuum. We were being asked that question, quite honestly, because we had members of the Agriculture Committee and members who oversee the Foreign Assistance Committee saying, why year after year do we come to get money for this piece of what we are calling humanitarian assistance, but we've done it for 10 years. And there was the beginning of the look at how does one very consciously structure the use of humanitarian assistance and the use of development assistance in a way that makes a community more resilient when the same problem occurs 3 years later. So I just support Doug in saying there's been a lot of thought about that at USAID, and I think a lot of very positive movement.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Moore, for your comment. And I'm inviting again Dr. Daniel Gersten for a comment at this point.
Well, I don't really have much to add. I'm just enjoying the discussion. I'd like to, hear what the ambassadors have to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, at this time, if we may ask some of our distinguished colleagues who are attending this event, maybe to ask a question or to make a comment.
We have two open questions, written questions submitted via Q&A. One is from Tony Feinberg. The question is, it is perhaps likely that climate change will lead to greater global needs for disaster relief. Is this taken into account in future of U.S. planning? And the second question from Curtis Pearson. We seem to have a good handle on quantifying the aid and support we deliver. Do we have a good methodology for quantifying the impact that support has on relief and recovery based on the type of disaster? And then after the panelists answer those questions, there is also Bob Turner who raised hand to ask a question, maybe in audio.
Okay. Any response from any of the panelists?
I'm not sure anyone knows what the effect of climate change is going to be in the long term. We already know that if you, and I think it was Ambassador Ray, who talked about the number of incidents we had in 1960 versus the number of incidents we've had recently. And we know that many of the things that we call sort of man-made emergencies, and we know that many natural emergencies that are out of cycle, those particular being flood and drought, are having an effect upon productive capacity of citizens and is moving many of them to a crisis of hunger. And we know that number is going to increase. We're not sure how much it's going to increase. If you listen to David Beasley, who's leaving the World Food Program this week, you'll hear that he always talks about the explosion of populations who are now food insecure. And it's a problem that we all know is coming, and I'm not sure anyone has been able to tell you exactly what its effect is at this point in time.
Okay, thank you for your insight. Anyone else on the climate change?
Hey, Yona, I'm happy to come in just for a moment here and talk a little bit about, we did some work after the Puerto Rico hurricane, and we looked at what it would take to sort of build back the Puerto Rican government and the whole area and what gets redone and what doesn't get redone. And it's a really complex issue. We did this on behalf of FEMA, as well as with support from the governor of Puerto Rico. And I mean, it's just so complex. I mean, we see this in many ways that there's this push often on the ground to just rebuild what's there. But that's really a self-defeating proposition. What you want to do is not just rebuild something that was existing, but figure out ways in which you, as somebody mentioned on the discussion already, is build resilience into your critical infrastructure, into your society, so that the next time a hurricane hits, you're not going to have the same sorts of outcomes. And this is obviously very challenging. It creates a lot of emotion in terms of how much funding and, are we trying to rebuild after a disaster, or are we trying to completely build a society? And the answer might be yes to both, but we have to figure out how to do that and do it more efficiently. So these are discussions that are actually continuing to be held within the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I know that they do this in coordination with USAID, and so it is very complex.
Okay, thank you very much for your insight again. And Georgian, can
Yes.
you repeat the second question again?
Yes, yeah, I will repeat the second, and there is another one from Mihail Ionescu from Romania. So the second question is from Curtis Pearson. We seem to have a good handle on quantifying the aid and support we deliver. Do we have a good methodology for quantifying the impact that support has on relief and recovery based on the type of disaster? So that's the second question. And then the question from Mihail Ionescu, again, it's a general question to all panelists. I'm from Romania, a country close to Turkey and prone to earthquakes. What lessons learned recently in Turkey concerning prevention, namely preparing in advance to minimize the deadly effects of such disasters? Thank you.
Yeah, I can try to take a stab at those. With regard to quantifying the impact our assistance has, that's a challenging question. It's one that we certainly need to have answered. We too often in a disaster focus on counting trucks. We're doing this, we see this in northern Ethiopia, we see this in the Ukraine, we see this in the Turkey-Syria border crossing. Our metric is how many trucks crossed today. And that doesn't necessarily tell you how many people we were able to assist that day, how many people came out of a severe food insecurity into a different status or was provided that medical assistance. But trying to get those that do that sort of analysis into a region that may be unsafe or may not be able to host them at that time proves challenging as well. So it's a long way of me saying that your question is extremely valid, Curtis, but we don't quite have that answer yet on being able to quantify in a sudden onset disaster how we move from needing assistance to needing less or not needing assistance. We're able to do that in a more methodical and academic environment in some of the more protracted conflicts, but we have less of a handle on it in the immediate aftermath of a sudden onset disaster. And with regard to the questions on lessons learned, I don't think we're at the point yet of really rolling up our sleeves and looking at those lessons learned, but I can do some comparison and contrast between what we saw in Turkey and Syria and what I saw in Haiti after their earthquake recently as well, is that Turkey seemed very well prepared compared to a Haiti or a Syria in the sense that they're a G20 country. They have several internationally certified search and rescue teams. The minute the ground stopped shaking, their first responders kicked in and they had a mechanism to do so, and it was coordinated, and they were able to start saving lives immediately. But they needed more assistance because it was so overwhelming and devastating, the shocks that happened there. In Syria and Turkey, in Syria and Haiti, that are less trained in the international search and rescue techniques and have less infrastructure to do so. It was more of a people trying to help people, but not necessarily with the tools and resources needed to do so. And how many people weren't gotten to just because they lacked that training. So I think the lesson learned would be to have that first responder network, to have the infrastructure in place, to have the training in an area like Romania, Turkey, Syria, Haiti that are earthquake prone, to be able to respond immediately first while you're waiting for the national or an international response to come in. And then also taking a much longer look is, how do we build back better? How do we ensure there are building codes in place? And if there are building codes in place, how do we ensure that those codes are enforced during the rebuilding period? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
We have a question from Bob Turner. Bob, you can speak into your mic.
Okay.
Thanks, Yona. Let me start off by commending you and Don Wallace for another home run program. Really outstanding. I learned from it. I enjoyed it. I have a comment, but I would welcome comments on the comment. And it's very important for the United States to maintain the high moral ground in our dealings with the world. And our humanitarian assistance gives us a wonderful opportunity to do that. I particularly like Dr. Gernstein's observations about the mutual benefit of humanitarian assistance and diplomacy. They really are, as your title suggests, mutually supportive. I think back to 70 years ago when my father was an Air Force physician and was assigned to Oslo, Norway as a NATO advisor. This was a few years after World War II ended, but the Norwegians remembered it well and remembered our part in it. And time and again, I listened as Norwegian visitors praised the United States. We ended World War II with the largest and least damaged major army in the world. We suffered a lot of casualties, but not as compared to the Brits, the French, the Russians, or the Soviets, and others. And yet, rather than using our monopoly on atomic weapons, we rebuilt Germany and Japan. We set up the United Nations. We had the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And the Norwegians viewed us really as, to use the modern term, an exceptional country. They did not fear us. Had that not been the case, had we acted as a great power and said, we're the biggest guy in the block, and here's what we demand, the entire world would have had an incentive to unite against us. But that was not the case because we behaved honorably, I would say even nobly, during that time. I think it is extremely important to maintain the high moral ground. And even when we come to the aid of a country like Syria, run by a very anti-American leader, the people of the country will make judgments about us. And when their government is telling them that we are evil, and they see that we come in and give them food and medical assistance and so forth, that's a big plus for us in the big picture. And also, when we send a U.S. naval aircraft carrier to a disaster zone, that is mutually beneficial. We were still going to pay for that aircraft carrier to operate that day. The sailors on it get good training, and aircraft carriers turn out to be one of the most effective humanitarian relief instruments in the world. They can produce hundreds of thousands of gallons of potable water from seawater every day. They have helicopters that can reach people in disaster areas. They produce an incredible amount of electricity that can help power hospitals and other things on the land. They have medical facilities, emergency rooms and so forth. And so it costs us a little more, obviously, but generally the basic cost of that aircraft carrier is going to be borne by the American taxpayers, whether they're doing good in the troubled part of the world or waiting on the ocean for what we hope will never happen, an attack on the United States. But the benefits we get when the world sees America come to the aid, particularly when we come to the aid of people that have not normally been our friends, that buys us a lot of goodwill that I think converts to helping our diplomatic and even our military security issues.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. And I think I would like to turn this to our colleague, Professor Don Wallace, for some of your comments and insights. And we're getting close to, I think, to end this very stimulating discussion.
Well, let me make a few observations and have a question for Ambassador McGann. I presided involved in many panels, as Charlie knows. This has certainly been one of the best. If this is the U.S. deep state, I'm awfully proud of it. I'm so impressed by the sort of sophistication described by Mr. Stropes of our programs. I mean, it's impressive, and one really should be proud of it, quite frankly. Sort of another theme which comes out from Ambassador Romero and others, we're both the child of Woodrow Wilson and Henry Kissinger. On the one hand, and Bob sort of touched on this, our doing good is like lawyers, they do good and they end up doing well. I think there's a real value in being true to our best values, quite frankly. And at the same time, there is this whole question, how do we convert what we're doing, the immediate into the more long-term? I have a friend, Alex Alenikoff, colleague of mine at Georgetown, who was the deputy UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and he's always saying we should link work with refugees with development. And it reminds me of some of the things you're saying here. And the agencies, the international agencies, tend to be silos, and how do we bring them together to both promote long-term development and indeed our long-term security interests? I guess my question is about women. To Ambassador McGann, I served in the Middle East, in Turkey and elsewhere, and they're all very different, of course. And I think both of, just like a few thoughts as to how one makes, how can one make make these countries more sensitive, and many of them are already, incidentally, to a degree, to the gender issue. And then also just a mechanical question. I have a colleague whose son is in the Virginia survival and rescue team. I have the impression they're mostly Husky firemen and not fire women. So I said it's a sort of a two-pronged, maybe marginal question about women and this process we're talking about, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, thank you for that question. I must begin by saying that my familiarity with the Fairfax team goes all the way back to 1998 when I played unfortunately, I had to play a key role in our response to the bombings at Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And even at that time, while the majority of the Fairfax team that were sent to Nairobi to help dig out the rubble of the buildings surrounding our embassy, there were still women included in that. All right. So I think that we should not shortchange our own selves in terms of the access we've given women writ large. But I think to your broader point that how do we engage other countries in their perceptions of gender equality and equity? That's going to be a very difficult challenge for us as the United States. I think that there's a great deal of global understanding of the importance of women's roles, but the application of that is not universal. I think that obviously in the Middle East, and I don't want to necessarily start a discussion about the role of Islam, but the interpretation of Islam in the Middle East varies from country to country. What we expect to find in Egypt and Tunisia, for example, we're not necessarily going to find even in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, or as we saw in Turkey and Syria. Although I will say that the more you find women participating in various roles in conflict situations, you find greater equity and equality. So that's a little peep that goes towards Syria, but it's going to be a challenge. At the same time, I think what we have to do is understand that our planning for disaster response and humanitarian assistance is broader than the Middle East. To be clear, we can foresee even more deployments on HADR in the Indo-Pacific, where these issues aren't necessarily as difficult as they are in the Middle East. At the same time, if we go back to the tsunami in Indonesia, which is still largely a Muslim country, we were able to effectively create equitable outcomes for the delivery of humanitarian assistance in that crisis. So I think that, it's almost situational as we go about it. But if we have, I think, as Americans, as well as with our partner countries, at least a uniform approach, then we can address these greater universal issues of gender equity and equality.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wallace. As the clock is ticking, and we have to end our discussion. First, final word. Or can I just make one comment as a young academic that, if I may mention that going all the way back when Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant, remarked about the value system, he said that unity comes before peace and cooperation. I was very blessed to have an opportunity subsequently to spend time at the United Nations and to work on technical assistance around the world. And I really think that we are moving now to the holiday season from the Jewish perspective, Passover, the Islam, the Ramadan, the inspirational, and then of course Christianity in terms of the holiday. So if I may mention a common value system to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and I quote, whoever saves one person, one life, is though it saves the entire world. So with that done, please, perhaps you can close our discussion.
All right, Yonah, you insist on my saying something. Well, I really want to thank everyone. This was really of a very high level, and several of you pointed out that you'd learned from your colleagues. But again, I think Americans we're often too hard on ourselves. I was at AID years ago, and come a long way, by the way, upward, if I may say so, Doug. Actually, Samantha Powell is my neighbor across the street. She's an impressive woman, as you know. No, but I think this is a very impressive panel, Yonah, really, and I hope we will have a written proceeding as we usually do, because I think there was a lot of learning here, and we should share it as widely as we can. So, Yonah, thank you very much.
Thank all of you, and let's hope for a peaceful holidays, and to continue the important humanitarian service to humanity. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.